His life ended in a gruesome act of incredible brutality.
I saw him hit the head, and I saw the flesh be ripped apart.
And then he's discarded like trash.
He thought that it was a bag of meat with the flies swarming around it.
The only clue was a message cut into the victim's torso.
Someone had carved the words "Blood's Rule."
When it comes to gangs, the situation could be fatal.
Is it a clue or a false lead?
Oftentimes, perpetrators think they are smarter than cops.
But who is the monster capable of such cruelty?
He flirted with his girlfriend. He was a very angry man.
He did one of the sickest things anybody could do.
It just seems unreal.
And how many people are involved?
He didn't care who he was going to bring down with him.
It's almost like a spider web.
The more people know, the harder the secret is to keep.
I feel bad for you. I feel bad for you.
July 8th, 2001. It's a sleepy Sunday afternoon in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, a rural community 2 hours east of Minneapolis.
Chippewa County is known for being quite foresty, lots of lakes, known for rustic getaways.
Very family-oriented community, very quiet, peaceful, and quaint.
It's the region's rustic charm that has brought Elroy Leha out to his property just east of Otter Lake.
Elroy was the owner of a vacant property that he was looking to sell. He had a potential buyer that was coming to view the home, and as he was cleaning up, he noticed a bag with flies swarming around it. And as he gets closer, there is this horrible smell.
Curious as to what is causing the odor, Mr. Leha cautiously opens the bag.
He cannot believe what he sees.
To his shock and dismay, it was actually a dismembered torso. He immediately called the police.
Little does he know that the case will lead police more than an hour away, to St. Paul, Minnesota.
130 miles west was a mother who was trying to reach her son.
Her son is 20-year-old Bobby Holder.
But no one has seemed to see Bobby the past couple days.
Bobby, it's Mom. Please call me back. I'm getting worried about you.
He was an adult, but he did live at home, and this just wasn't like him.
Bobby Holder had a simple life.
He was a very easygoing person. 20 years old, entire life ahead of him.
Most people thought he was jovial and a good guy.
Currently between jobs, Bobby was living with his parents, but he was anything but idle.
He really enjoyed working with cars. It was a true passion of his.
And he was turning that passion into his main source of income.
I got rims if you need them. I can get you a set. How much money you got to spend?
He was into selling car parts, and he could do some repairs on vehicles.
In November of 2000, Bobby had been given the perfect gift for a car enthusiast.
It was Bobby's birthday, and he ended up receiving his most prized possession. It was a vintage car from the 80s. He was ecstatic.
But cars weren't Bobby's only interest.
He loved the ladies, and the ladies loved him.
You can go for a ride.
Okay, let's go.
Come on.
He would take his car out and drive up and down the popular streets.
Back in those days, it may sound strange today, but you could actually pick up the ladies if you're driving on the street and you kind of cruise and, hey, how you doing? You know? And I'm sure Bobby was that type.
There were two things that everyone knew about Bobby, is that he could fix your car and he would steal your girl.
There was no denying Bobby was a ladies' man, but he was also a father.
He did have a young baby with someone, and he also had a girlfriend that was kind of off and on. But for the most part, he was just doing his thing.
He just had this carefree and exuberant approach to life.
But now his future is uncertain.
Bobby?
On July 6, 2001, Bobby and his car mysteriously vanished.
And after 2 days without seeing or hearing from him, his mother's concern is turning to panic.
She just knew that something wasn't right, and she didn't have an explanation initially, but she had that gut feeling.
Hey!
So his mother began to reach out to his friends, girlfriends, even acquaintances, desperate for any information.
But no one could locate Bobby.
Meanwhile, 130 miles to the east in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, police have responded to a call of a possible dead body on the property of Elroy Leha.
The officials confirmed that what Elroy found was indeed a dismembered torso wrapped in trash bags. They believed that the individual was a male, approximately 25 to 35 years old.
But without fingerprints or dental records, it's the victim's skin that offers officials their most important clue in identifying the body.
Thankfully, there were a few tattoos. On his chest, he had LSP written on it.
Can we turn them over?
The word Scorpio was tattooed at the base of his neck, and there was a Native American chief tattooed on the stump of his right arm.
That's really all they have to go by are these 3 tattoos.
Except for one other mark on the body. One the police hope wasn't made while the victim was still alive.
In addition to the 3 tattoos that the detectives find on the torso, they do find a strange carving on his back.
Investigators suspect it's a message left by the killer.
Maybe this is gang related?
It actually reads, "Blood's rule."
In 2001, 20-year-old Bobby Holder was enjoying a carefree summer in St. Paul, Minnesota.
He loved hanging out with his friends. He loved working on cars.
He was a ladies' man. He'd see a nice-looking lady walking down the street, he would talk to her, and he wasn't shy about that.
But now, Bobby has been missing for several days.
Bobby still hadn't come home, and his mom was really worried at this point.
Bobby's mom made every effort and then some to find out where he might be.
But no one has any information until she gets a call from one of Bobby's friends, Phil Hamilton.
Bobby liked to work on cars, and he would sometimes buy and sell parts. He had a set of aftermarket wheel rims, the kind that people would use to customize their cars.
Phil Hamilton told Bobby's mom that he remembered Bobby was trying to sell his rims to a guy named Darnell.
Bobby and Darnell Smith had agreed on a price. And sometime later, Bobby told him he and their other friend Mo were going to meet up with Darnell on Lake Street in Minneapolis.
Well, what's that got to do with where he's at now?
He said that Darnell might have some more information. But Phil mentioned to Bobby's mother that she should tread lightly because he had just gotten out of prison.
Determined to speak to Darnell, Bobby's mother reaches out to her son's cell phone provider.
She was able to access the phone records, and she was able to narrow down a few phone numbers that she didn't know and start calling around.
Eventually, she finds what she's been looking for.
She calls a number listed on the log that turns out to be Darnell.
She confirms that he is the Darnell that Bobby sold the rims to.
I arranged a sale. I didn't meet up with him. My girl picked him up.
Okay.
He hadn't heard or talked to him since.
With Darnell a dead end and her son still missing, Bobby's mother files a missing persons report on July 10th with the St. Paul police.
When Bobby's mom is talking to the police, she's giving them all the information, his height, his weight, and that he has some pretty distinct tattoos.
Yeah, he's got a Scorpio tattoo on his neck. He's got LSP written on his chest. And he has like a Chief Indian tattoo on his arm.
She gives them enough information that, God forbid they find a body, they can identify it.
When the report is shared to other jurisdictions, it's seen by the Sheriff's Department in Chippewa County, Wisconsin.
The sheriff's department was still trying to identify the dismembered torso found on Elroy Lejas' property.
And the tattoos of their John Doe clearly match the description in the missing persons report for Bobby Holder.
They're able to connect the dots that this is actually Bobby.
With their victim identified, the Chippewa County detective meets with Bobby's mother.
Chippewa County investigators had to do the difficult task of notifying the family of the deceased.
I'm so sorry for your loss, ma'am.
To say, hey, is this tattoo your son? That couldn't have been easy for police, but it had to be 1,000 times worse for her.
They have his body parts in a bag 100 miles to the east of where she lives. You can't even imagine how devastating, how crushing that would be.
Despite her shock and grief, Bobby's mother is able to confirm that the tattoos belong to her son.
In one of the most difficult moments of her life, Bobby's mother was able to identify him based off of the tattoos.
The detective then asks if it was possible that Bobby was involved in gang activity.
Once you join the gang, you're in that gang for life. You have to surrender blood to exit the gang. The situation could be fatal, and it appears that this might be an avenue that investigators might look at.
The killer had cut Blood's rule in the victim's back. However, Bobby's mother was adamant that her son was not involved in a gang.
Bobby's mom responded with a no. Bobby was a good kid.
She does admit, though, that Bobby sometimes smoked marijuana, and occasionally he even sold some.
Like a lot of 20-year-olds, he would sometimes make a little extra cash by selling pot to people that he knew. But that was hardly something that could lead to such a horrible crime.
But Bobby's mother tells the detective she recently learned something that might be important to the case.
The last activity that Bobby's mom could tell detectives for sure, and she had gathered that from a close friend, was that he was supposed to sell some car rims to a guy named Darnell.
And after filing the police report, she finally got in touch with a man who had gone with Bobby that night. His friend, Mo.
He'd said when he and Bobby delivered the rims, they didn't meet with Darnell, just his girlfriend.
And Mo thinks he might have had more than business on his mind.
He was a true ladies' man.
Meeting with Darnell's girlfriend without Darnell, he definitely would have been flirting.
She wondered if that might have upset Darnell.
The dismembered torso of Bobby Holder has been found dumped in Chippewa County, Wisconsin. And his mother has told police that shortly before he disappeared, he may have been flirting with another man's girlfriend.
Knowing her son being the flirty ladies man, she's not sure, but she wouldn't put it past him.
Bobby had sold a set of wheel rims to a man named Darnell Smith. But when he and his friend Mo delivered the rims, they didn't meet with Darnell, just his girlfriend.
And Mo had told Bobby's mother that this meeting may have sparked the motive behind Bobby's disappearance.
Detectives now want to speak to Mo. They want to figure out what went down during that transaction.
But before police can track down Mo, Bobby's car is found.
One of Bobby's friends spotted his car in a parking lot about 40 miles east of St. Paul in Baldwin, Wisconsin, and called his mother.
After Bobby's parents retrieve their son's car, an investigator tracks down Mo Jones.
Bobby and Mo had met in summer school, known each other about 4 years.
When asked about the night Bobby sold the rims to Darnell, Mo said it all started when they were hanging out at another friend's house.
While hanging out with his friends, Bobby did step away to take a phone call.
When he came back, he told Mo that somebody wanted to buy his rims. He was excited, but a little hesitant because of who wanted to buy the rims.
He said it was Darnell.
That's Darnell Smith.
Yeah, they call him Tequila, like a street name.
Okay.
Bobby knew he had just got out of jail, and he was a little nervous because he had a reputation.
Still, a meeting was arranged, but with Darnell's girlfriend Tina instead of Darnell.
On the way to the meeting, Bobby gave Mo the impression that he was interested in more than just selling the rims.
Hey, you know Darnell's girl?
Nope.
Man, she is something special.
Bobby's ladies' man self is just telling Mo like she's pretty cute.
She surely piqued his interest.
At the meetup, things went smoothly. At first,
Hey, you Bobby?
Yeah, that's me. Nice to meet you.
You too.
Heard a lot about you.
Oh, what'd you hear?
None but good things.
but as they were talking, Tina got a call from Darnell.
Darnell called to make sure. She inspected the rims to make sure nothing was wrong with them.
And Bobby didn't like that.
When Bobby heard this, he got offended.
Let me talk to him.
Let's talk to you.
Bobby got on the phone to talk directly to Darnell.
What you think, I'm trying to play you? Come on, man. You're not gonna find any rims like this. Not for no $800. It's not even a scratch on.
Apparently, Darnell thought the price included installation.
Look, that's not what we agreed on.
So what happened?
Bobby said he'd do it, but he didn't have the right tools on him.
He's telling Mo how he needs to go pick up a few materials because he is going to install the rims.
Even though this was a week before Bobby disappeared, the detective suspects there's a connection.
So police, they start to look into Darnell.
He does have a criminal history, and it's extensive.
He was a registered sex offender for assaulting a 12-year-old, and he had just got out of jail.
Darnell's probation officer is able to shed more light on what the arrest record suggests.
The detective speaks to Darnell's parole officer, and they find out a lot of information about him, especially about his emotional intelligence.
Darnell is a very self-centered person, and he really only cared about himself.
Darnell was known to have an incredibly violent streak. He was known to have a very short temper.
He's prone to lashing out, temper tantrums when he doesn't have his way.
Does that mean Darnell is capable of murder?
Detectives feel like even though they did have that heated exchange over the phone about price and installation, was that really enough of a motive to kill and dismember this man like that?
But their doubts are dispelled when the probation officer mentions Darnell's girlfriend.
Crime novelists often talk about that aha moment that police get. You go, whoa, what do I have here?
The parole officer tells detectives that Darnell's girlfriend's name is Tina Leha.
Tina's last name was the same last name as the man who discovered Bobby's remains.
What are the chances that the two aren't connected?
A detective investigating the murder of Bobby Holder has just uncovered information about Darnell Smith's girlfriend Tina that may prove crucial to the investigation.
Her last name is Leha. They put together the fact that, wait a minute, Bobby's body was discovered by a guy named Leha in Wisconsin.
It turns out to be no coincidence. Elroy Leha is Tina's father.
Does this prove that she was involved in Bobby's murder?
And was Darnell.
He was recently released from prison for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl.
Darnell was known to have an incredibly violent streak. He was known to have a very short temper. He was just a violent person.
Looking for answers, the investigator takes a closer look at Tina Leha.
Tina was this all-American student that people looked up to.
She was a girl that had big dreams.
One of her dreams was a career where she could help others.
She went to college to become a social worker.
She wanted to help and give back to the Native American community.
Unfortunately, her dream was derailed by financial problems.
Tina left college and had to get a job. She took the first opportunity that presented itself, and she became a corrections officer at Stillwater Correctional Facility.
But then Tina crossed a line.
Shortly after Tina was hired as a corrections officer, she met Darnell Smith. And as a correction officer and he as a prisoner, they started a very taboo relationship.
I bet you look fine underneath that uniform.
They're with each other for 8 hours to 12 hours a day. They get closer and closer. Before you know it, you have a relationship.
The relationship led to her doing things that she normally wouldn't have done.
Tina started smuggling in drugs and other contraband, even nude photos of herself for Darnell.
Eventually, the nude photos came to the attention of other prison employees.
Darnell had been showing them to other inmates, even letting them borrow the photos.
After an official investigation into her conduct, Tina was fired. But that wasn't the end of their relationship.
She then got herself placed on his visitors list to go see him at the jail that she once worked at.
It's like, at this point, I've already lost my job, so I might as well stay, because what else? Everybody in the community already knows.
Police are almost certain Darnell and Tina are connected to Bobby's murder. But they're still lacking hard evidence that ties them to the crime.
Everything they have is completely circumstantial.
Detectives are kind of at a loss until they receive a phone call.
The caller is Darnell's younger brother, Ramon Smith.
Now they have a new person, Ramon, who might just add another layer of information to the investigation.
And he agrees to come in for an interview.
Ramon is pretty transparent with police. He knows about what happened to Bobby.
Ramon tells the investigators that on July 5th, Darnell comes to him asking him to fight Bobby with him and their brother Shaka.
Did you do it? No, sir. No way. I did not want to be a part of that.
The next day, when Ramon asked Darnell what ended up happening with Bobby, Darnell told him that Bobby had never shown up.
But Ramon suspects Darnell was lying.
A few days go by after that original conversation. He notices that his brothers and Darnell's girlfriend Tina all seem really strange and jumpy.
Ramon knew something wasn't right.
His suspicions were confirmed a few days later, when Darnell asked him to come over to his house.
While they were sitting on the steps, Darnell tells Ramon what really happened. He tells him that he had Tina call Bobby over to the apartment.
Get him over here now.
Come on.
Darnell said he had it, and he was going to make sure that Bobby never flirted with his girlfriend again.
Tina told Bobby that Darnell would not be home.
Look, do you want to come over tonight? No, he won't be here for hours.
But Tina wasn't alone at the house.
Darnell was there with his brother Shaka, waiting for Bobby to come over.
Darnell beats him senseless.
Darnell and Shaka not only beat him up, but they killed him.
Ramon Smith has just told police that his brother Darnell confessed to him that he murdered 20-year-old Bobby Holder.
He's taken aback that his brother really was involved.
Ramon explains that after Bobby was dead, Darnell and Shaka had cut up the body.
He had a small hatchet, 2 knives, and a box cutter, and that it took him 5.5 hours.
Ramon tells the detectives that Darnell and Shaka then called a neighbor to come over, and that neighbor came to help dispose of the body.
The neighbor's name is Andre Parker.
And then he had Andre and Tina get rid of the body parts.
It was his understanding that they had taken the dismembered body and dumped it out in the country.
Do you know the whereabouts of Shaka at this time?
He's at work in St. Paul.
After interviewing Ramon, police pick up Shaka at the restaurant where he works and bring him down to the station.
When the detective sat down with him in the interrogation room and told him that he was under arrest for his part in the murder of Bobby Holder, he denied knowing anything about it.
You really don't know what this is about? No, I don't.
But when the detective pressures him, his story changes.
It's not long before he just folds and confesses everything.
My brother, Tequila, and I were Shaka were in the kitchen, and Bobby had came in. And so we're all in the house. So it's you, Darnell, and Tina in the house. Right.
The weight of knowing that I have participated in a crime such as this, the only way to get the relief is to confess and tell it all.
Shaka admits that Darnell killed Bobby.
Shaka tells detectives that his main motive was that Bobby was trying to get with his girl.
He said, but see, he's been calling my girlfriend trying to get her. So I'm like, what do you mean? You're just like trying to go out with
Someone liked his girlfriend and he didn't like it, and he took matters into his own hands.
Shaka thought Darnell was just going to give Bobby a beatdown.
According to Shaka, Darnell got Tina to arrange for Bobby to come over to see her.
He liked her, so she knew that he would probably take her up on that offer of coming over.
She like was like bait, I would say.
Shaka tells detectives Darnell has everything orchestrated. He has Shaka be the lookout when Bobby arrives to make sure he arrives alone.
He said, Shaka, why don't you go out and look out and see if anybody's home. If there's anyone who's home or anywhere. And I was like, okay, whatever. And so, as soon as I did that, I came back and I was like, nobody's there.
After getting the all clear from Shaka, Darnell sets his plan in motion.
Darnell begins to attack him with a heavy flashlight and is bludgeoning him over and over again.
Bobby is playing with him. He's asking him to stop. He's confused. He's scared. He's not understanding why this is going on.
He's apologizing for anything he may have done.
Yeah, what's up now? Ladies, man.
He then brandishes a gun.
Darnell, please, man, why you doing this, man? You know why you here.
Then Darnell pulled the trigger.
I was sitting there, I got hit with blood, and I backed up, started flipping out, moving back and forth, like, I kept saying, I can't take this, I can't take this.
But Bobby was still alive.
At this point, Bobby is begging for his life.
He said, I'm having trouble breathing. He said, let me get up and take myself to the hospital. When he said that, my brother said, no, you ain't doing that because then you're going to go to the doctor.
Shaka said that Darnell then fired a second shot, killing Bobby.
The blood was like all over the floor. And he's like, Shaka, help me get this up. I was like, I'm not helping you pick it up, I'm sorry.
But Shaka admits he didn't leave.
You don't leave because you're kind of afraid. Yeah.
Darnell dragged the body into the basement alone.
Shaka told investigators that he eventually went down to the basement to see what Darnell was doing. Darnell had a small hatchet in his hand.
He said, look at this, and he was decapitating Bobby's head from the shoulder. My son couldn't take it, so I threw up.
He cuts off his arms, his legs.
That level of violence and savagery is unimaginable.
He did one of the sickest things anybody could do, was he shook the dude's hands. Like, I ain't going back in the studio with him fire.
All that was left to do was to get rid of the pieces. But Darnell had a plan for that, too.
Is there anybody else who has knowledge of or was involved in this murder and dismemberment?
There is one person that was involved. He wasn't really involved until like the last stages of it, but his name is Andre.
After booking Shaka on murder charges, police arrest Andre Parker.
Andre told the police basically everything that he knew.
You have no problem talking about this murder, correct? Correct?
No problem. No, I have nothing to do with that boy's death.
I'm sure having the opportunity to finally confess was a relief for Andre. He had an opportunity to finally remove the guilt that was associated with being a part of this.
Andre says that he'd stopped by for a visit when Darnell asked him to come down to the basement.
He puts one hand on your shoulder. He said, I want to show you something.
And what he showed him was horrifying.
The dismembered body was already cut up and put in bags, and he needed someone else to help drive the cars and dispose the body parts.
Andre felt trapped, like he had no way to say no to being involved.
Who said that?
Andre essentially admitted that him and Tina did the dirty work, disposing of the body while driving along the highway, getting rid of the different limbs.
He said that Tina was the one who knew where they were going. He was just following directions. If they wanted more information, they needed to talk to Tina.
And they need to do it soon.
He told the detectives that they need to find Tina and find her fast. Because if Darnell could do this to Bobby, he knows that Tina's life might be in danger.
She's in danger today. She's not that.
Detectives have arrested 2 people involved in the murder of Bobby Holder. Darnell Smith's brother, Shaka, and Darnell's neighbor, Andre Parker.
And now police have a manhunt to embark on.
Darnell himself, who fired the shot that killed Bobby, has disappeared, along with his girlfriend, Tina Leha.
At this point, they're nowhere to be found.
They are trying to find Tina and Darnell before they possibly hurt someone else.
Or before Darnell hurts Tina.
Andre Parker told detectives that Tina was in danger being involved with Darnell.
Andre also believes Darnell will kill him for talking to the police. Police spend days tracking down Darnell's friends and associates.
Detectives were talking to everyone connected to him, looking for information on his whereabouts, but no one had a lead on him.
The manhunt spins its wheels until August 2nd.
They find out that Darnell and Tina were taken into custody by authorities in a small town of Glendora, Mississippi.
The detective travels to Mississippi to question them.
Detectives speak to both Darnell and Tina, but neither one of them will speak, and they both ask for legal representation.
The couple is brought back to Minnesota, where the district attorney offers Tina a way to help herself.
She's offered a plea. The plea will have her serving probably 6 years of time.
She turns it down. She's sticking with Darnell.
Unlike Tina, Andre Parker accepts the prosecutor's offer of a deal.
Andre pled guilty to aiding an offender and was sentenced to 4 years in prison.
Darnell's brother Shaka also takes a plea deal.
He takes a lesser sentence, but it's still 20 years for murder.
There's really no telling why he kind of went along with what Darnell had asked him to do. Maybe he was afraid of him even though they're siblings.
Anyone who would go to the extent of dismembering a body should be feared.
Maybe he wanted to impress him. Maybe he didn't feel like he had a choice.
Whether Tina Leha willingly chose to help Darnell is the main issue when she goes on trial in January of 2002.
The prosecutor didn't claim that Tina knew Darnell Smith was going to murder Bobby Holder.
While he had more than likely planned in his mind about what he wanted to do upon meeting Bobby, he didn't convey that to Tina.
But the prosecution maintained she at least knew that Bobby was going to be assaulted.
This was a premeditated plan between her and Darnell. If it wasn't for Tina luring Bobby to the scene, Bobby would still be alive today.
The defense admits what Tina did, but she takes the stand to explain why she did it.
While she was on the stand, she pleaded and she cried that she went along with what Darnell said because she was afraid. She was afraid for her own life.
Tina claims that she left Bobby's body on her father's land to leave a trail for the police.
The only way she thought to get any degree of help was by doing an intentionally poor job of concealing the deceased body.
Tina says she needed help getting free of Darnell.
Like, if I knew better, I would have done better. And now I know, and unfortunately it's too late.
She tries to use some tears to sway the jury, but ultimately they see through it. They see the evidence that's laid out, and they find her guilty of second-degree murder.
She's still awaiting sentencing when Darnell Smith goes on trial a month later.
The prosecutor told the jury that there was never any doubt in Darnell's mind about what he was going to do to Bobby Holder for flirting with Tina.
Darnell was not going to be disrespected by somebody trying to take his girl.
It was premeditated, calculated steps, very intentional steps to end this man's life.
The jury reaches a decision after only 1 day of deliberations.
The jury has no problem in finding him guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bobby.
He receives the maximum sentence possible.
Darnell was sentenced to life without parole.
It's justice for Bobby Holder and for all the other lives Darnell ruined.
He didn't care about harming someone and the impact that that would have to that person, Bobby's family, and then, of course, the people around him that he had involved in the situation.
Including his girlfriend.
Tina is sentenced a few days later, and the judge sentenced her to 17 and a half years. While Tina portrayed herself as a victim, the judge told her the only victim here was Bobby Holder.
But for Tina, that isn't the final word.
Even after a person is convicted of a crime, they have an opportunity to appeal the verdict. In this case, Tina appealed her verdict, and her sentencing was reduced.
17 years got reduced to 12. I believe she's out today.
For families of the victims, this can be disheartening, and sometimes it can just be shattering for families that are trying to recover from the death of their loved one.
Of course, they can never fully move past what was done to the young man they loved.
Bobby's mother, she now has to live and die with the thoughts of her son forever. That's her legacy. That's it for her. Her holidays are not the same. Her life is different. Tina gets her life over. Shaka gets their life over. They all get to continue their lives, but Bobby didn't get to live his life.
And his life was taken for no reason.
Bobby Holder was a young man with his whole life ahead of him. 20 years old, attractive, doing positive things, happy in his own way. And his life was just cut short by a man unable to control his actions. It was just senseless.
There are crimes that vanish beneath the weight of time. Their evidence fades. Their witnesses grow old. Their victims become photographs tucked inside family albums, remembered only by those who refuse to let go. Police files gather dust. Detectives retire. Entire generations are born without ever hearing the names that once dominated newspaper headlines. And then there are the rare cases that refuse to die. Somewhere, buried inside a forgotten laboratory report, hidden within a single microscopic trace, waiting silently through changing presidents, advancing technology, and nearly 4 decades of unanswered questions. The truth remains patient. The murder of Pamela McCall was one of those cases. For 38 years, whoever ended the young nurse's life believed they had escaped forever. They were wrong, because science has a memory far longer than any human being. Long before DNA databases transformed criminal investigations, before forensic genealogy became one of law enforcement's most powerful weapons, before computers could compare millions of genetic profiles within minutes, investigators had little more than instinct, interviews, and hope. Hope was often all they had, and hope slowly disappeared as the years passed. Pamela McCall never imagined she would become the center of one of America's longest-running homicide investigations. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't living a dangerous lifestyle. She was simply a young woman building a future. Friends remembered her as caring, dependable, and deeply committed to helping others. Nursing wasn't just a profession for Pamela. It reflected who she was. She spent her days caring for people at their most vulnerable, believing that compassion could make unbearable moments easier to survive. The irony would become almost unbearable. A woman dedicated to saving lives would lose her own in an act of extraordinary violence. Her family expected her to come home. Instead, they entered a nightmare that would last almost 4 decades. Every unsolved murder begins with an ordinary day. The routine is what makes the ending so devastating. Morning coffee. A familiar drive. Plans for tomorrow. Phone calls left unanswered. Nothing announces that life is about to divide itself into 2 separate histories, before and after. For Pamela McCall, that ordinary rhythm ended in South Carolina during the summer of 1985. No alarm sounded. No witnesses rushed into the streets. No one realized that somewhere nearby, a killer was making decisions that would leave investigators searching for answers for nearly 40 years. When Pamela disappeared from the normal pattern of her life, concern arrived quietly at first. Family members called. Friends checked with one another. Coworkers wondered why someone so reliable had suddenly become unreachable. Hours turned into worry. Worry became fear. Before long, law enforcement was forced to confront a possibility no family ever wants to imagine. Something had happened. Search efforts intensified. Investigators retraced her known movements. Every location became important. Every conversation mattered. Every minute carried new significance. Then came the discovery that transformed a missing person investigation into a homicide. Pamela McCall had been found dead. The news struck with devastating force. Shock spread rapidly through the community. Healthcare workers who had known Pamela struggled to comprehend how someone devoted to caring for strangers could become the victim of such unimaginable brutality. The crime scene told investigators one undeniable fact. This was no accident. Someone had intentionally taken her life. Every inch of the location became evidence. Crime scene technicians photographed everything. Measurements were recorded, footprints examined, fibers collected, biological samples preserved with methods considered advanced for the mid-1980s. Investigators understood that homicide scenes never offered second chances. Once contaminated, once overlooked, evidence could disappear forever. What they recovered that day would eventually outlive careers, outlive expectations, and ultimately outlive the confidence of the person responsible. At the time, however, none of that was obvious. The investigation exploded into motion. Detectives interviewed relatives, friends, neighbors, co-workers, former acquaintances. Anyone who had spoken with Pamela in the days leading to her death suddenly became part of an enormous investigative puzzle. Questions repeated endlessly. Did she mention meeting someone? Did anyone seem interested in her recently? Was she frightened? Had she argued with anyone? Did anything unusual happen during her final days? Most answers led nowhere. Some created temporary optimism. Others collapsed under closer examination. As the days became weeks, investigators assembled lists of possible suspects. Every serious homicide investigation follows familiar patterns. Current relationships, former relationships, co-workers, random offenders, individuals with histories of violence, known sex offenders, people connected geographically to the crime scene. Every possibility had to be explored. Every lead demanded attention. The pressure was relentless. Communities expect quick arrests after violent crimes. Families desperately need explanations. News organizations demand updates. Police departments know that the first 48 hours often determine whether justice will ever arrive. Yet some investigations refuse to cooperate. Evidence points in conflicting directions. Witnesses remember different versions of the same events. Rumors multiply faster than verified facts. The Pamela McCall investigation slowly entered that dangerous territory where certainty began dissolving into speculation. Despite hundreds of interviews, despite countless investigative hours, no definitive suspect emerged. The case remained active, but momentum gradually weakened. That was perhaps the cruelest part. Unsolved murders rarely end with dramatic announcements that detectives have failed. Instead, they fade. Each passing month brings fewer headlines, fewer television reports, fewer phone tips. The public moves on. Families cannot. Pamela's loved ones continued waking every morning with exactly the same unanswered question. Who did this? Birthdays arrived. Christmas came and went. Anniversaries returned. Every milestone carried the same invisible absence. Every family photograph reminded them someone should still be standing there. Meanwhile, investigators refused to abandon the evidence. Although forensic science in 1985 lacked many modern capabilities, experienced detectives understood an important principle. Never throw anything away. Technology changes. Evidence does not. A fingerprint that means nothing today may become priceless tomorrow. A biological sample impossible to analyze this year may identify a killer decades later. So they preserved everything they could. Boxes, envelopes, slides, laboratory records, evidence seals, chain of custody documentation. Items that seemed ordinary in one decade might become revolutionary in another. No one could predict how rapidly forensic science would evolve. During the late 1980s and into the 1990s, DNA technology transformed criminal investigations across America. Cases once considered impossible suddenly reopened. Convictions became stronger. Wrongful convictions were overturned. Serial offenders who believed they had disappeared into history suddenly found investigators knocking at their doors. For families of cold case victims, Every scientific breakthrough brought renewed hope. Maybe this time. Maybe now. Maybe our case. The McCall investigation continued waiting. Evidence periodically returned to forensic laboratories as testing methods improved. Each advancement promised possibilities that had never existed before. Sometimes the results disappointed. Sometimes samples proved too small. Sometimes degradation limited what scientists could recover. But investigators persisted. Cold case detectives possess a unique kind of patience. Unlike active homicide squads racing against immediate deadlines, they work against history itself. They reopen forgotten files. Read yellowing interview notes. Listen again to decades-old witness statements. Search for contradictions overlooked years earlier. Most importantly, they ask a dangerous question. What if everyone missed something? That question has solved countless murders. Not because earlier detectives were careless, but because every investigation reflects the knowledge available at that moment in time. Science advances. Methods improve. Tiny details become enormously important. The smallest overlooked trace can suddenly carry overwhelming significance. Somewhere inside Pamela McCall's evidence collection rested exactly that kind of detail. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Not immediately understood. Just one silent biological clue waiting for technology to catch up. For nearly 4 decades, it remained locked inside police evidence while the outside world changed beyond recognition. Children born after Pamela's murder grew into adults. Investigators who first examined the crime scene retired. Some passed away. Police chiefs changed. Governors changed. Entire forensic laboratories modernized. DNA sequencing became exponentially more precise. National databases expanded. Computers replaced filing cabinets. Cold case units received specialized funding. And still, Pamela McCall waited. Not as a person, but as a promise. A promise that someone had stolen her future. A promise that evidence still remembered what human memory could not. Some killers imagine time as their greatest ally. Vittnessysteem. Victims are forgotten. Evidence deteriorates. Communities heal. Police departments shift attention elsewhere. Eventually, they convince themselves that justice has an expiration date. History keeps proving them wrong. Because unlike memory, evidence never grows nostalgic. It never forgets. It never changes its story. It waits. Quietly. Patiently. Until someone finally learns how to ask the right question. The hardest part of any murder investigation is not arriving at a crime scene. It is staying with the case after the crowds disappear. The flashing patrol cars eventually leave. Television cameras move on to fresher tragedies. Newspaper headlines shrink from front-page banners to brief anniversary columns. Detectives receive new assignments. The world continues turning as if nothing happened. Only the victim's family remains frozen in time, forced to relive the same unanswered questions with every passing year. That was exactly what happened after the murder of Pamela McCall. Investigators refused to label the case as forgotten, but reality was impossible to ignore. Every promising lead had been explored. Every known associate had been interviewed, some more than once. Tips continued to arrive, yet nearly all of them dissolved under careful examination. Rumors spread throughout the community, attaching suspicion to neighbors, acquaintances, and complete strangers. None could be supported by evidence strong enough to justify an arrest. A homicide investigation cannot survive on suspicion alone. It survives on proof. And proof remained painfully out of reach. Inside evidence lockers, sealed containers held the physical remnants of a violent crime. Each item had been cataloged with meticulous care. Detectives understood something that the public rarely considered. Evidence collected during the first hours after a murder often becomes more valuable with age, not less. Scientific methods evolve. Questions once impossible to answer suddenly become routine. An item dismissed as insignificant in one decade may become the centerpiece of an investigation in another. That philosophy kept Pamela's file alive. The case was reviewed repeatedly over the years. New detectives inherited stacks of reports prepared by officers they had never met. Yellowed interview transcripts sat beside updated laboratory analyses. Photographs taken with film cameras were digitized. Handwritten notes were entered into computer databases. Nothing was discarded. Every page represented the possibility that one overlooked detail might finally reveal the person responsible. Cold case investigators often describe their work as entering conversations that began decades earlier. They read witness statements as though interviewing the witnesses themselves. They examined crime scene photographs with fresh eyes. They asked questions that previous investigators could not ask because the technology simply did not exist. The murder of Pamela McCall became exactly that kind of investigation. Each review began with the same uncomfortable realization. The killer had almost certainly left something behind. Violent crimes rarely occur without physical contact. A struggle creates opportunities: hair, fibers, biological material, fingerprints, trace evidence invisible to the naked eye. Criminals frequently believe they have erased every sign of their presence. Reality tells a different story. Every movement leaves consequences. Every contact transfers something. That simple principle, known to forensic scientists for generations, would eventually reshape countless cold cases across the United States. But during the late 1980s, DNA profiling remained in its infancy. Laboratories possessed extraordinary potential but limited capability. Samples that appear perfectly usable by today's standards often exceeded the technology available at the time. Detectives frequently heard the same frustrating answer. The evidence existed. Science simply could not unlock it. Years passed. America entered the 1990s. DNA evidence became increasingly accepted inside courtrooms. Jurors learned unfamiliar scientific terminology. Prosecutors began relying on genetic evidence with growing confidence. Innocent people were exonerated. Violent offenders were identified years after committing crimes they believed had disappeared into history. Across the country, police departments quietly reopened old homicide files. Pamela McCall's investigation was among them. Every advancement justified another look. Laboratory specialists carefully re-examined preserved evidence using techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Some tests produced little information. Others confirmed earlier conclusions without identifying a suspect. Investigators experienced the emotional rhythm familiar to every cold case unit: hope, disappointment, renewed determination. Repeat. The cycle continued for years. Meanwhile, Pamela's family carried a different burden. Unlike investigators, they could not place the case back on a shelf between assignments. For them, every birthday remained incomplete. Every family gathering contained an empty place. Every milestone reminded them of the years Pamela never had the opportunity to experience. Marriage. Children. Growing older. Retirement. All of it had been stolen in a single act of violence. Families of homicide victims often describe time differently than everyone else. The calendar moves forward. Grief does not. Investigators understood that reality better than anyone. Cold case detectives frequently maintain contact with surviving relatives long after public attention disappears. Sometimes the conversations contain new developments. More often they do not. Yet those meetings serve another purpose. They remind everyone involved that the victim was never just a case number. Pamela McCall had dreams. She had coworkers who remembered her kindness. She had friends who expected to grow old beside her. She had parents and relatives who refused to stop believing justice remained possible. That belief mattered. Because solving a decades-old murder requires persistence, bordering on obsession. Every few years, another scientific breakthrough reignited optimism. DNA extraction became more sensitive. Testing required increasingly smaller samples. profiles grew more complete. National databases expanded as convicted offenders submitted DNA under changing state and federal laws. Each edition increased the possibility that an unknown genetic profile might eventually find a match. Investigators checked. And checked again. Nothing. The silence became almost routine. Still, they refused to destroy the evidence. That decision would prove critical. As forensic laboratories entered the 21st century, a remarkable shift occurred. Scientists were no longer satisfied with obtaining partial answers. They sought complete genetic profiles from evidence once considered too limited or degraded to analyze. Cases from the 1970s resurfaced. Murders from the 1980s suddenly produced viable DNA. Assault investigations long considered unsolvable began moving again. The impossible slowly became ordinary. Cold case detectives across America watched with cautious optimism. They had learned never to celebrate too early. Science can identify possibilities. Investigators must still prove guilt. For Pamela McCall's case, renewed testing generated fresh discussions among investigators. The preserved biological evidence remained central to every strategy meeting. Detectives reviewed chain-of-custody records with exceptional care. Evidence collected decades earlier would eventually face intense courtroom scrutiny if a suspect were ever identified. Every transfer, every laboratory submission, every storage record had to withstand legal examination. Nothing could be left to chance. The integrity of the evidence had survived for decades. It needed to survive a little longer. Technology continued advancing at astonishing speed. Computers processed genetic information that once required weeks of manual analysis. Sophisticated software compared profiles with unprecedented accuracy. Laboratories developed methods capable of extracting useful DNA from increasingly challenging samples. Each advancement narrowed the killer's margin for escape. Some investigators privately wondered whether the person responsible even knew these developments were taking place. Did they still think about the crime? Had they convinced themselves it would remain unsolved forever? Did they follow new stories about forensic breakthroughs with growing anxiety? Or had confidence replaced fear after so many silent years? No one knew. That uncertainty defined every cold case. The suspect continued living somewhere. Perhaps under the same name. Perhaps surrounded by family members unaware of a hidden past. Perhaps believing the worst was over. Evidence suggested otherwise. Unlike human witnesses, DNA never changes its testimony. It cannot be intimidated. It cannot forget details. It cannot become confused by the passage of time. If properly preserved, it waits indefinitely for someone capable of interpreting its message. By the early years of the new century, investigators increasingly recognized that old evidence represented one of their greatest assets rather than their greatest limitations. The Pamela McCall investigation entered another exhaustive review. Boxes were reopened. Photographs examined again. Laboratory reports compared with modern standards. Detectives challenged long-held assumptions, asking whether earlier conclusions remained valid under contemporary forensic science. Nothing was accepted simply because it had always been accepted. That mindset transformed cold case investigations nationwide. Sometimes the breakthrough came from revisiting forgotten witnesses. Sometimes it emerged from overlooked documents. Sometimes it arrived through a single microscopic trace preserved by careful crime scene technicians decades earlier. Pamela's case appeared to belong to that final category. The answer had never disappeared. It had merely remained beyond the reach of available science. The clock continued moving relentlessly toward 4 decades. Many people associated with the original investigation had retired. Younger detectives now carried responsibilities once handled by officers who first walked Pamela's crime scene in 1985. They inherited not only evidence and reports, but also an obligation. Finish what others had started. Bring an answer home. The passage of time had changed almost everything. Roads looked different. Buildings had been demolished. Businesses had opened and closed. Neighborhoods evolved. Yet one thing remained exactly as it had been on the day Pamela McCall lost her life. The biological evidence secured by investigators all those years earlier. Silent. Untouched. Patient. Waiting for the moment when science would finally become powerful enough to reveal the name it had concealed for nearly 38 years. Time has a way of creating illusions. The longer a murder remains unsolved, the easier it becomes to believe the truth has disappeared forever. Witnesses move away. Memories lose their sharp edges. Streets change. Buildings are demolished. Entire neighborhoods evolve until they barely resemble the places investigators first searched. What once felt immediate slowly becomes history. But evidence does not experience time the way people do. It does not forget. It does not forgive. It simply waits. As the years stretched into decades, the investigation into Pamela McCall's murder entered a new phase, one that had little to do with knocking on doors and everything to do with advances inside forensic laboratories. Cold case detectives knew something that every experienced investigator eventually learns. No murder is ever truly finished until every available scientific method has been exhausted. The evidence recovered in 1985 had already been examined countless times. It had survived transportation between laboratories, changes in investigative teams, improvements in storage procedures, and repeated reviews by homicide specialists. Each examination asked a slightly different question. Each one hoped for a different answer. Most produced none. Yet failure did not discourage investigators. It refined them. Every unsuccessful test eliminated possibilities. Every negative result narrowed the path forward. The investigation became less about finding new evidence than understanding old evidence more completely. That distinction mattered. Because in many cold cases, the breakthrough is not hidden somewhere investigators have never looked. It is hidden inside something they have possessed from the very beginning. By the early 21st century, forensic DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered hopeless suddenly moved with astonishing speed after biological evidence was re-examined using techniques unavailable during the original investigations. Police departments everywhere began reopening aging homicide files. Some of those decisions made national headlines. Families who had waited 20, 30, even 40 years finally heard the words they thought might never come. We have identified a suspect. Those announcements carried enormous emotional weight. They also carried responsibility. Detectives understood that identifying someone through DNA was only one part of the investigation. Every scientific finding had to withstand rigorous legal scrutiny. Every step in the chain of custody had to remain intact. Every laboratory procedure had to meet exacting standards. Cold cases are won as much inside courtrooms as inside laboratories. The Pamela McCall investigation followed that same philosophy. Rather than rushing toward conclusions, investigators carefully evaluated every development. Advances in DNA technology offered possibilities that earlier detectives could scarcely have imagined, but technology alone could not replace careful police work. Science identifies. Investigators verify. Prosecutors prove. Those three stages had to work together. The biological evidence collected in 1985 remained central to the investigation. Years earlier, crime scene technicians had preserved material that they believed might someday become important. At the time, no one knew precisely how valuable it would be. They simply followed one of the oldest principles in forensic science. Preserve everything. Future investigators may know what today's investigators do not. That decision proved remarkably forward-thinking. Across the country, countless cold cases had already been lost because evidence was discarded before DNA testing became widely available. Some police departments simply lacked storage space. Others believed old evidence no longer served a practical purpose after investigation stalled. The consequences were irreversible. Once destroyed, evidence can never be recreated. Pamela McCall's case avoided that fate. The evidence remained preserved. Protected. available. As laboratories developed increasingly sophisticated testing methods, investigators periodically submitted items for renewed analysis. Each submission reflected confidence that science had advanced beyond previous limitations. Sometimes only tiny amounts of biological material remained. Decades of storage presented challenges. Environmental conditions could affect samples. Earlier testing methods occasionally consumed portions of the available evidence. Forensic scientists therefore approached every examination with extraordinary caution. They understood they might have only one opportunity to perform certain analyses. Nothing could be wasted. Behind every laboratory report stood a family waiting for answers. While science progressed, detectives continued performing the quieter work that rarely attracts public attention. Old witness statements were reread. Original investigative decisions were reevaluated. Detectives compared interviews conducted years apart, searching for inconsistencies or forgotten details. Cold case investigations demand patience unlike almost any other area of law enforcement. There are no daily press conferences, no urgent manhunts, no dramatic raids. Instead, progress often arrives one page at a time. One laboratory result, one carefully reviewed report, one overlooked sentence buried inside thousands of pages of investigative files. The murder of Pamela McCall required exactly that level of persistence. Investigators refused to assume that earlier detectives had overlooked obvious clues. Instead, they recognized a simpler reality. The original investigators worked with the best tools available in 1985. Modern investigators possessed better ones. That difference changed everything. Across the forensic community, DNA analysis continued evolving at remarkable speed. Laboratories became capable of developing more complete genetic profiles from increasingly limited samples. Improved extraction methods allowed scientists to recover information previously considered beyond reach. Each advancement expanded the possibilities. Each advancement narrowed the distance between evidence and identity. Yet experienced detectives remained cautious. A DNA profile, however powerful, is not the end of an investigation. It is the beginning of a new one. If a profile points toward an individual, investigators must establish opportunity, corroborate evidence, verify timelines, and ensure every conclusion rests upon facts rather than assumptions. The standard remained unchanged. Justice requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. Nothing less. As renewed forensic work continued, the Pamela McCall investigation slowly regained momentum. Not public momentum. Investigative momentum. Inside police offices, discussions became increasingly focused on scientific evidence rather than speculation. Detectives understood that after so many years, memories could become unreliable. Biology could not. The case file grew thicker. Laboratory reports became more detailed. Forensic terminology that barely existed in the mid-1980s now occupied entire sections of investigative summaries. Progress no longer depended solely upon interviews. It depended upon molecules invisible to the naked eye. Somewhere inside that preserved evidence existed a genetic story waiting to be interpreted correctly. Investigators believed that story belonged to the killer. The challenge was proving it. Every cold case presents investigators with a difficult balance. Move too slowly, and opportunities disappear. Move too quickly, and mistakes become irreversible. The detectives responsible for Pamela McCall's case chose caution. Every new finding underwent careful review. Independent verification strengthened confidence. Documentation remained meticulous. They understood something crucial. If the investigation ultimately identified a suspect after nearly 4 decades, every decision would be examined in extraordinary detail. Defense attorneys would challenge procedures. Experts would review laboratory methods. Jurors would expect convincing explanations. Preparation began long before any arrest. That preparation reflected respect for both the victim and the justice system. Pamela McCall deserved certainty. Not speculation. Not theories. Facts. Only facts. As the investigation continued, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The evidence collected in 1985 had endured. The science had caught up. The gap separating investigators from the truth was shrinking. Slowly, methodically, almost invisibly. Outside the investigation, life continued as it always had. Families celebrated birthdays. Children graduated. Communities changed. Few people remember the headlines from decades earlier. Yet inside evidence storage facilities and forensic laboratories, Pamela McCall's case remained very much alive. Each sealed package represented unfinished business. Each preserved sample represented possibility. Each careful examination honored the belief that no victim should be abandoned simply because years have passed. Cold cases are often described as investigations suspended in time. That description is only partly true. The evidence remains suspended. Science does not. It keeps advancing. And with every advance, the distance between an unknown killer and accountability becomes just a little bit shorter. For nearly 38 years, whoever murdered Pamela McCall had every reason to believe history was on their side. History, however, had underestimated science. And science was getting closer. There is a moment in every cold case investigation when the past stops feeling distant. It does not happen with flashing lights. It does not arrive with dramatic confessions or anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Instead, it begins quietly. A laboratory technician studies data on a computer screen. A detective receives a routine report. A prosecutor asks one more question. And suddenly, a file that has remained motionless for decades begins to move. For the investigators assigned to Pamela McCall's murder, that moment had been years in the making. The advances in forensic DNA analysis were no longer theoretical. They were producing results in homicide investigations across the country with astonishing consistency. Cases from the 1970s and 1980s, once thought permanently beyond reach, were yielding answers because biological evidence had survived long enough for science to catch up. Pamela's case remained among those waiting. The evidence had never disappeared. It had simply waited for the right technology. Every submission to the laboratory represented another opportunity to hear what the evidence had been trying to say since 1985. Scientists approached the preserved material with extraordinary care. Unlike fresh evidence collected from an active crime scene, decades-old biological samples cannot be replaced. Every procedure had to maximize information while preserving as much material as possible for future testing if needed. The work demanded precision measured in microscopic quantities. DNA molecules invisible to the human eye now carry the weight of an entire homicide investigation. For detectives, each laboratory update produced cautious optimism. Experience had taught them never to celebrate too early. Cold cases have a reputation for creating false hope. A partial profile appears promising before proving incomplete. A witness suddenly remembers something, only to contradict physical evidence. A tip generates excitement before collapsing under verification. Veteran investigators learned to trust only evidence that could withstand relentless scrutiny. That philosophy guided every decision. The renewed forensic examinations gradually produced information that investigators had never possessed before. Biological evidence collected decades earlier now revealed details that earlier generations of scientists simply lacked the ability to recover. It was an extraordinary reminder that technology does not rewrite history. It uncovers it. The importance of preserving crime scene evidence could not have been clearer. If even one critical sample had been discarded years earlier, the investigation might have reached a permanent dead end. Instead, detectives found themselves studying increasingly meaningful laboratory findings. The investigation began shifting. Not toward certainty, toward possibility. That distinction mattered. Possibility creates direction. Certainty requires proof. Every promising result generated another series of questions. Could the findings be replicated? Had contamination been ruled out? Did the laboratory procedures meet current forensic standards? Would independent experts reach the same conclusions? Investigators insisted upon answering every one of those questions before moving forward. The passage of nearly 4 decades meant every conclusion would eventually be examined under a microscope inside a courtroom. Nothing less than absolute confidence would be acceptable. As laboratory work continued, detectives returned once again to the original investigative files. Thousands of pages documented interviews, timelines, crime scene observations, forensic reports, and follow-up inquiries spanning decades. Reading those files was like stepping into another era. Typewritten reports, handwritten notes, photographs developed from film, maps marked by hand, telephone logs recorded long before email became routine. The investigation itself reflected the evolution of American policing. Yet despite changes in technology, one thing remained remarkably consistent. Good detective work never goes out of style. Every report reflected careful observation. Every interview demonstrated persistence. The original investigators had done everything possible with the tools available to them. Modern detectives were simply benefiting from scientific advances unimaginable in 1985. Rather than replacing traditional investigation, DNA evidence strengthened it. Each new forensic finding had to fit within the established timeline. Every movement had to make sense. Every conclusion required corroboration. Investigators refused to allow science alone to tell the story. Science identifies. Context explains. Together, they reveal the truth. Across the United States, forensic laboratories were entering a remarkable period of innovation. More sensitive extraction techniques, improved amplification methods, higher quality genetic analysis, the ability to recover useful DNA from samples once considered unusable transformed the landscape of criminal investigations. Cold case units watched these developments closely. Every improvement represented another chance. Not only for Pamela McCall, for thousands of families waiting across the country. The emotional burden carried by those families cannot be overstated. Time does not erase violent loss. It merely changes its shape. The sharp shock of tragedy slowly becomes a permanent absence. Parents grow older. Siblings build lives around unanswered questions. Children become adults without ever fully understanding the person whose life was taken before they had the chance to know them. Justice delayed remains deeply personal. Pamela's loved ones continued waiting. They had witnessed decades of investigative effort. They had endured periods of silence. They had seen hope rise and fall repeatedly. Yet they never abandoned the belief that someone, somewhere, still knew the truth. Investigators shared that belief, not because of intuition, because of evidence. Physical evidence does not care how much time has passed. It cannot be persuaded. It cannot be intimidated. It cannot be convinced to tell a different story. When interpreted correctly, it speaks with remarkable consistency. That consistency became increasingly important. As forensic specialists refined their analyses, detectives recognized that the investigation was approaching a critical stage. The biological evidence was no longer simply preserving possibility. It was beginning to narrow the field. Every exclusion became meaningful. Every confirmed scientific observation strengthened the overall picture. The investigation slowly shifted from asking, "Who could have done this?" toward asking, "Whose biological evidence is this?" The difference was profound. For decades, investigators had searched outward. Now the evidence itself was leading inward. Cold case detectives often describe moments like these as conversations with the victim. Not literally, but through the evidence left behind. Every laboratory result answers a question the victim no longer can. Every scientific breakthrough restores a small piece of the truth stolen by violence. Pamela McCall could no longer tell investigators what happened during the final moments of her life. The evidence could. And it was finally beginning to do exactly that. Still, caution remained essential. Experienced prosecutors reminded investigators that identifying a potential suspect would only begin the next phase. Evidence had to withstand legal challenge. Procedures had to remain beyond criticism. Every scientific conclusion required careful documentation. The larger the breakthrough, the greater the responsibility to ensure absolute accuracy. No one wanted a rushed investigation after 38 years of waiting. They wanted the right answer. Nothing else would honor Pamela's memory. Meanwhile, outside the investigation, the world had changed almost beyond recognition. The streets where detectives once conducted interviews looked different. Businesses had opened and closed. Children born after Pamela's death were now middle-aged adults. Entire careers had begun and ended. Yet inside secured evidence rooms, sealed packages remained exactly as they had been decades earlier. Labels, case numbers, evidence tape. Quiet reminders that some promises never expire. The promise to seek justice. The promise to preserve the truth. The promise that no matter how many years pass, a murderer should never feel completely safe. Because time, once considered the killer's greatest ally, had become something entirely different. Time had allowed science to evolve. It had allowed technology to surpass imagination. It had transformed a tiny biological trace into a voice capable of reaching across 38 years. Investigators could now hear that voice more clearly than ever before. And for the first time since the summer of 1985, they began to believe that the evidence was no longer asking questions. It was preparing to provide answers. By the time nearly 4 decades had passed, the investigation had become something few homicide cases ever achieve. It had outlived generations of detectives. The officers who first walked the crime scene in 1985 had built careers, retired, and in some cases passed away. New investigators inherited not only their files, but also their determination. Every report, every photograph, every carefully preserved piece of evidence represented a promise made to Pamela McCall and to those who loved her. The promise was simple. Do not stop. Cold case detectives often describe their work as solving puzzles assembled by people they have never met. They inherit decisions made decades earlier, relying on documentation created in another era. Every handwritten note matters. Every evidence log matters. Every laboratory submission matters. Because if one link in that chain fails, years of work can collapse. The investigators assigned to Pamela's case understood that responsibility. Nothing could be assumed. Everything had to be verified. The renewed forensic effort continued with extraordinary caution. Scientists revisited biological evidence collected from the original crime scene, applying methods that simply did not exist when Ronald Reagan was still in the White House. The contrast was remarkable. In 1985, DNA profiling was still an emerging discipline. By the early 2020s, laboratories could extract astonishing amounts of information from biological material once believed too limited to analyze. Technology had changed. The evidence had not. Every successful analysis reinforced a critical reality. The killer had not walked away unnoticed. They had carried away the illusion of safety, but they had left something behind. Something that neither weather, nor passing years, nor fading memories could erase. Investigators increasingly focused on building a complete forensic picture rather than chasing speculation. That distinction became essential. Rumors had surrounded the case for years. Names had circulated. Theories had multiplied. Some appeared convincing until tested against the evidence. Others collapsed almost immediately. Experienced homicide detectives know that speculation is seductive. Evidence is reliable. The investigation stayed with the evidence. Every conclusion had to emerge from facts capable of surviving courtroom examination. Laboratory scientists worked alongside investigators, discussing results in painstaking detail. DNA profiles are powerful, but they are not interpreted in isolation. Context determines significance. Where was the biological material found? How was it deposited? Could innocent transfer explain its presence? Had contamination been excluded? Every question demanded a scientifically supported answer. There were no shortcuts. The larger the breakthrough, the more carefully it had to be examined. As months of renewed analysis continued, detectives recognized something they had not felt in years. Momentum. Not public excitement. Investigative momentum. The file that had remained largely dormant for decades was once again generating meaningful work. Meetings became more frequent. Laboratory consultations became more detailed. Evidence that had once been viewed simply as preserved material was now producing information capable of directing the investigation. It was the kind of progress every cold case unit hopes to experience. Yet optimism remained restrained. Veteran investigators had witnessed promising cases unravel before. A partial DNA profile might exclude dozens of individuals without identifying the right one. A laboratory result might require additional confirmation before it could support investigative decisions. Nothing would be rushed. Justice delayed demanded precision, not speed. Meanwhile, Pamela McCall remained at the center of every discussion. Not merely as a victim. As a person, investigators revisited family photographs, read old interviews, reviewed descriptions provided by friends and coworkers. They wanted younger members of the investigative team to understand who she had been before the headlines. A dedicated nurse, a daughter, a friend. A woman whose future had been stolen long before forensic science possessed the tools to pursue the truth effectively. That perspective mattered. Cold case investigations are not exercises in history. They are active attempts to fulfill promises left unfinished. Across America, similar investigations were producing remarkable results. Cases from the 1970s and 1980s were reaching courtrooms because preserved biological evidence finally yielded answers. Families who had spent decades believing justice might never arrive were suddenly watching suspects appear before judges. Those successes inspired investigators everywhere. Pamela's case remained among those waiting. The evidence suggested it did not intend to wait forever. As forensic methodologies continued improving, detectives revisited one of the oldest principles in criminal investigation. Every contact leaves a trace. The concept, first articulated by forensic pioneer Edmund Locard, had guided investigators for generations. Whenever two objects come into contact, something is exchanged. Hair, fibers, skin cells, biological material invisible to the naked eye. Criminals rarely appreciate how difficult it is to erase every trace of their presence, especially during violent encounters. Investigators believe that principle had worked in Pamela McCall's favor. The biological evidence preserved in 1985 represented exactly the kind of silent witness Locard had described decades earlier. It had remained loyal. It had remained unchanged. Now it was finally becoming understandable. The growing body of forensic information began narrowing investigative possibilities. Each exclusion became valuable. Each confirmed scientific observation reduced uncertainty. Slowly, methodically, the investigation moved closer to identifying the individual whose DNA had remained hidden within the evidence for nearly 38 years. Detectives understood that identification alone would not end the case. They would still need to reconstruct history. Where had the suspect been? How did they connect to Pamela? What evidence beyond DNA supported the investigation? What explanations, if any, might exist for the presence of biological material? Every answer required corroboration. Cold case prosecutions demand extraordinary preparation. Unlike recent crimes, memories fade. Witnesses become unavailable. Physical locations change. The evidence must therefore carry even greater weight. That burden required meticulous attention. Investigators prepared as though every scientific finding would eventually be challenged by experts retained by the defense. Because it almost certainly would. They welcomed that scrutiny. Reliable science withstands examination. Reliable evidence grows stronger under questioning. The investigation continued building patiently. Outside law enforcement, almost no one realized how much activity was taking place behind closed doors. There were no dramatic press conferences, no public declarations, no headlines announcing imminent arrests. The work unfolded quietly. Laboratory reports moved between agencies. Detectives compared timelines. Prosecutors evaluated legal strategies. Each step brought the investigation closer to a point it had not reached since 1985. Direction. Not certainty, but direction. For Pamela's family, even the smallest indication of progress represented something precious. Hope. A dangerous emotion after decades of disappointment, yet impossible to abandon completely. Families of homicide victims often speak of justice as something larger than punishment. It is recognition. Recognition that the victim mattered. Recognition that the truth matters. Recognition that time alone should never determine whether accountability exists. Investigators shared that belief. Every hour invested in Pamela McCall's case reflected it. The passage of 38 years had not diminished the seriousness of the crime. If anything, it had strengthened the determination to solve it. Because every unsolved homicide sends two messages. One to the victim's family, another to the person responsible. For decades, the second message may have seemed reassuring. You got away with it. The investigators intended to replace that message with another. Not today. Not anymore. The evidence collected on a summer day in 1985 had survived longer than anyone could have imagined. It had crossed generations, outlasted technology, outlasted assumptions, outlasted silence. And with every new scientific advancement, it came one step closer to revealing the identity of the person who believed that time could erase the consequences of murder. Time had done the opposite. It had preserved the opportunity for justice. Now, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, investigators could begin to see the outline of a path leading toward the truth. A path built not on rumor, not on fading memory, but on the quiet, unwavering testimony of evidence that had never stopped waiting. By the late 2010s, cold case investigations across the United States had entered an entirely new era. The revolution did not begin inside interrogation rooms. It began inside laboratories. For decades, detectives had relied on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, interviews, and confessions. DNA had already transformed criminal justice, but another breakthrough was quietly changing the rules once again. Scientists and investigators were learning that even when a DNA profile did not match anyone in law enforcement databases, it could still point investigators in the right direction. The search no longer depended entirely on finding the suspect. Sometimes, it began by finding the suspect's relatives. That idea would have sounded almost impossible in 1985. Now, it was becoming one of the most powerful tools available to cold case investigators. The murder of Pamela McCall remained under active review. Investigators continued working closely with forensic specialists, carefully evaluating every avenue permitted by law and supported by science. The biological evidence preserved decades earlier had become more valuable than anyone could have imagined on the day it was collected. Every improvement in forensic technology increased its importance. Every scientific breakthrough reopened possibilities that once seemed permanently closed. Yet investigators remained disciplined. They understood that solving a murder after nearly 4 decades demanded more than excitement over new technology. It required patience, verification, documentation. Every conclusion had to withstand the highest legal standards. Because after 38 years, there would be only one opportunity to present the truth. The investigation moved deliberately. Detectives revisited timelines, first established in 1985. Travel records, employment histories, known associations, geographic connections. Nothing was considered too insignificant. Cold cases often turn on details that seemed ordinary decades earlier. A forgotten address, an old driver's license, a workplace record, a chance encounter remembered only after years of reflection. Every piece fits somewhere. The challenge was discovering where. At the same time, forensic experts continued extracting every possible detail from the preserved evidence. The biological material collected from Pamela's murder scene remained remarkably important. It had survived because investigators decades earlier understood something fundamental. Evidence should never be measured only by its immediate value. Its greatest significance may lie in the future. That principle had protected Pamela's case through changing administrations, changing investigative teams, and changing forensic standards. Now the future had finally arrived. Inside police departments, cold case detectives often describe investigations like this as conversations across generations. The original detectives asked the first questions. Modern investigators finally receive the answers. Every handwritten report from 1985 became part of that conversation. Every evidence envelope represented another voice refusing to disappear. Technology had changed. Commitment had not. As the renewed investigation gained momentum, detectives also examined the broader context surrounding Pamela's life. Not because they believed earlier investigators had overlooked obvious suspects. Quite the opposite. They wanted to ensure that every known fact remained consistent with modern forensic findings. The process was exhaustive. Friends, coworkers, past acquaintances, people interviewed decades earlier. Investigators compared historical records against newly available information. Most inquiries confirmed what detectives already knew. Some eliminated lingering uncertainties. Each review strengthened confidence that the investigation was moving in the right direction. The passage of time had one unexpected advantage. Records that once existed only in filing cabinets could now be searched digitally. Archived newspapers became searchable. Historical property records became easier to access. Employment information could often be reconstructed with greater accuracy than investigators in 1985 had been able to achieve. The investigation benefited not only from advances in DNA science, but from improvements in information management itself. The smallest historical detail could suddenly become relevant. Cold case work demands exactly that kind of persistence. Nothing is ignored. Nothing is assumed. Every fact earns its place. Meanwhile, Pamela's family continued living with the consequences of unanswered violence. Nearly 4 decades had passed. Children born around the time of her death were now adults. Parents had grown older. Friends carried memories that refused to fade. The calendar had changed thousands of times. Their questions had not. Who killed Pamela? Why had it taken so long? Would justice ever arrive? Those questions remained at the heart of every investigative decision. Detectives understood they were working not simply to identify a suspect, but to provide an answer that could withstand history itself. There could be no uncertainty, no shortcuts, no speculation, only evidence, only facts. As forensic specialists refined their analysis, investigators recognized that the biological evidence was becoming increasingly complete. What had once appeared to be only a limited scientific resource was now revealing information with remarkable clarity. The evidence was speaking more confidently than ever before. Detectives listened carefully. Every laboratory report underwent independent review. Every scientific conclusion required corroboration. Experienced investigators welcomed skepticism. Good science survives questioning. Reliable evidence becomes stronger when challenged. That philosophy protected the integrity of the investigation. The goal was never simply to make an arrest. The goal was to make the correct arrest. That distinction separates successful cold case investigations from unsuccessful ones. Across America, several famous unsolved murders had recently reached dramatic conclusions through renewed forensic analysis. Those successes demonstrated something extraordinary. Time was no longer protecting offenders. It was protecting evidence. The longer biological material remained properly preserved, the greater the possibility that future scientific advances would reveal information unimaginable when the crime occurred. Pamela McCall's case embodied that reality. The evidence collected in 1985 had become stronger with age, not because it changed, but because humanity's ability to understand it had changed. Detectives often reflected on the remarkable irony. The person responsible may have believed each passing year reduced the chance of discovery. The opposite was happening. Every year brought better laboratories, more precise technology, improved analytical methods, expanded investigative resources. Time had quietly switched sides. The investigation entered another critical stage. Law enforcement agencies coordinated closely with forensic experts and prosecutors, ensuring that every development received appropriate legal evaluation before further action was considered. Nothing leaked publicly. Nothing suggested imminent breakthroughs. From the outside, the case appeared as silent as it had been for decades. Inside investigative offices, however, the pace had changed dramatically. Meetings became increasingly focused. Evidence charts expanded. Case reviews intensified. Detectives could feel something they had not experienced in years. The investigation was no longer searching blindly. It was following evidence toward a destination. No one predicted exactly where that destination would lead. Experienced investigators knew better than to assume outcomes. Evidence sometimes surprises everyone. Yet confidence continued growing. Not confidence in theories. Confidence in science. Confidence in the painstaking work performed by generations of investigators who refused to discard evidence, refused to surrender to time, and refused to allow Pamela McCall's name to disappear into the archives. The case had survived because people believed that one day the truth would become visible. Now, after nearly 38 years, that belief no longer seemed like optimism. It began to resemble inevitability. Somewhere beyond the laboratory reports, beyond the preserved evidence, beyond thousands of pages of investigative files, one individual continued living with knowledge no one else possessed. They alone knew exactly what happened on the day Pamela McCall was murdered. For decades, that knowledge remained hidden, protected by silence, protected by time, protected by the limitations of science. Those protections were disappearing, one by one, method by method, test by test. The distance between an unknown killer and accountability had never been smaller. And for the first time since 1985, investigators could realistically envision the moment when the evidence would no longer point only toward the truth. It would point toward a name. As the investigation entered its fourth decade, the focus shifted almost entirely to one question. Could modern forensic science succeed where the technology of 1985 had fallen short? Cold case investigators understood that the answer no longer depended on finding a new eyewitness or uncovering a forgotten confession. The key had always been preserved inside the evidence collected at the original crime scene. What had changed was not the evidence itself, but the ability to examine it. Advances in DNA analysis had already transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once believed impossible to solve were being reopened as laboratories developed increasingly sensitive methods for recovering and interpreting biological evidence. For detectives assigned to Pamela McCall's case, these developments offered a realistic opportunity to revisit evidence that had been carefully preserved for decades. The investigation became a collaboration between experienced detectives, forensic scientists, and prosecutors. Every step required careful documentation. Before any investigative conclusion could be reached, the integrity of the evidence had to be confirmed once again. Chain of custody records were reviewed. Laboratory procedures were scrutinized. Investigators knew that any future prosecution would depend not only on scientific results, but also on demonstrating that the evidence had been properly collected, stored, and analyzed throughout its history. The passage of nearly 40 years presented obvious challenges. Witness memories had inevitably faded. Some individuals interviewed during the original investigation were no longer available to speak with detectives. Physical locations associated with the investigation had changed. Businesses had closed. Roads had been altered. The surrounding community had evolved significantly since the summer of 1985. Yet one critical element remained unchanged. The physical evidence collected during the homicide investigation had been preserved. That preservation reflected a long-standing principle in homicide investigations. Never assume today's scientific limitations will remain tomorrow's limitations. Detectives who collected evidence in 1985 could not have predicted the capabilities of forensic laboratories decades later, but preserving the evidence ensured that future investigators would have the opportunity to apply new techniques as they became available. Across the country, similar decisions were producing remarkable results. Numerous cold cases from previous decades had been solved because biological evidence retained sufficient DNA for modern analysis. Each successful investigation reinforced the importance of careful evidence preservation. Pamela McCall's case was no exception. Investigators continued reviewing both the forensic evidence and the extensive investigative file assembled over many years. Original reports, witness interviews, crime scene documentation, laboratory findings, and supplemental investigative notes were examined together rather than in isolation. The objective was to determine whether new scientific findings aligned with the established facts of the case. This approach reflected an important reality of homicide investigations. DNA evidence rarely stands alone. While genetic evidence can identify or exclude individuals, investigators must still place those findings within the broader context of the crime. Timelines, known movements, relationships, opportunity, and corroborating evidence all remain essential components of a successful prosecution. As forensic work progressed, investigators maintained that disciplined approach. They avoided drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. They verified results through established laboratory procedures. They coordinated closely with prosecutors to ensure that every investigative step complied with applicable legal standards. Such caution is particularly important in cold case investigations. The passage of decades often increases the importance of forensic evidence while simultaneously reducing the availability of other forms of proof. As a result, scientific findings must be both reliable and carefully interpreted. For Pamela McCall's family, the continued investigative activity represented something they had carried with them for many years: hope. The investigation had never officially been abandoned. Although public attention had largely faded over time, detectives continued to review developments in forensic science and evaluate whether those advances could assist the case. The family's patience reflected the reality faced by many relatives of homicide victims whose cases remain unresolved for years or even decades. Nationally, the growing success of cold case investigations demonstrated that time alone does not eliminate the possibility of justice. Instead, advances in science can gradually reduce the barriers that once prevented investigators from identifying suspects. Improved DNA testing, enhanced laboratory methods, and increasingly sophisticated forensic analysis have fundamentally changed the investigative landscape. The McCall investigation increasingly reflected those broader developments. Each scientific advance provided investigators with another opportunity to evaluate preserved evidence using methods unavailable during the original investigation. Rather than relying on speculation, detectives continued allowing the evidence itself to guide their decisions. That methodical process required patience. Cold case investigations rarely progress quickly. Laboratory analysis can require significant time. Scientific findings must be independently reviewed. Investigators must verify every conclusion before determining whether additional investigative steps are warranted. Although these procedures may appear slow, they are designed to ensure accuracy. For the family of Pamela McCall, accuracy mattered as much as resolution. After decades of waiting, any answer would need to be supported by credible evidence capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. Investigators understood that responsibility. Their objective was not simply to identify a suspect. Their objective was to establish the truth through reliable evidence and lawful investigative methods. By this stage of the investigation, one fact had become increasingly clear. The careful preservation of evidence in 1985 had created opportunities that investigators could never have anticipated at the time of the murder. Advances in forensic science had transformed that preserved evidence from a historical record into an active investigative resource. The case demonstrated an important lesson repeated throughout modern criminal investigations. Scientific progress does not change the facts of a crime. It changes humanity's ability to discover them. That principle would ultimately shape the final stages of one of South Carolina's longest-running homicide investigations. The renewed forensic work did not produce an immediate arrest. Like most cold case investigations, progress came through a series of deliberate, carefully documented steps rather than a single dramatic breakthrough. Investigators understood that any development emerging after nearly 4 decades would be examined in extraordinary detail. Every conclusion had to be supported by evidence that could withstand independent scientific review and legal scrutiny. As laboratory findings became clearer, detectives focused on integrating the scientific results with the historical record assembled since 1985. This meant revisiting thousands of pages of investigative material. Original witness interviews were compared with later statements. Crime scene documentation was reviewed alongside updated laboratory reports. Investigators reconstructed timelines using both the original case file and records that had become more accessible through modern information systems. The objective was straightforward: determine whether the emerging forensic evidence was consistent with the known facts established during decades of investigation. Cold case investigations frequently require this level of verification. A DNA result may identify an individual connected to biological evidence, but investigators must still answer critical legal and investigative questions. How does that individual relate to the victim? Can their presence be explained through innocent circumstances? Is there corroborating evidence supporting the forensic findings? Are the historical facts consistent with the scientific conclusions? Only after those questions are addressed can investigators determine whether the available evidence supports criminal charges. Throughout this process, prosecutors worked closely with detectives and forensic specialists. Their role was not simply to prepare for trial. They also evaluated whether the available evidence satisfied the legal standards necessary for prosecution after such a long passage of time. Cold case prosecutions often present unique challenges. Witnesses may no longer be available. Memories inevitably fade. Some physical locations have changed significantly. Jurors must therefore rely heavily on documentary evidence, forensic analysis, and the careful preservation of investigative records. That reality placed even greater importance on the integrity of the original investigation. The evidence collected in 1985 had been preserved with sufficient care to remain useful decades later. The documentation accompanying that evidence proved equally important. Every transfer between agencies, every laboratory submission, every examination, every storage record. Together, they established a continuous history demonstrating that the evidence remained secure and properly handled throughout the investigation. This continuity strengthened confidence in the forensic findings. The case also reflected a broader transformation in homicide investigations nationwide. For many years, cold cases were often viewed as investigations with diminishing prospects for resolution. Advances in forensic science have fundamentally changed that assumption. Today, properly preserved biological evidence may become more valuable over time as analytical methods continue improving. Investigators increasingly recognize that evidence collected decades earlier may answer questions that could not be addressed when the crime originally occurred. Pamela McCall's case illustrated that principle. The biological evidence had remained unchanged since 1985. What changed was science's ability to analyze it. As investigators continued their review, they maintained the same disciplined approach that had guided the case for decades. No conclusion was accepted without corroboration. No assumption replaced evidence. No investigative decision was made solely because it appeared plausible. Instead, detectives relied on the cumulative weight of independently verified facts. That method required patience. Each scientific finding generated additional investigative work rather than immediate conclusions. Historical records required confirmation. Background information required verification. Investigators ensured that every component of a case supported the others before proceeding further. This deliberate process reflected the seriousness of the investigation. After nearly 40 years, the objective remained exactly what it had been in 1985. Identify the person responsible through reliable evidence. Provide an accurate account of the investigation. Present findings capable of withstanding judicial review. For Pamela McCall's family, the continued progress represented something that had endured through every stage of the investigation. The commitment of successive generations of investigators. Although personnel changed over the years, the case itself remained active. New detectives inherited not only investigative files, but also the responsibility to continue pursuing unanswered questions. That continuity is one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case investigations. Individual investigators retire. Institution continue. Evidence remains. As the investigation approached its final stages, detectives recognized that decades of careful evidence preservation and methodical review had positioned the case differently than at any previous point in its history. The scientific record had become substantially stronger. The historical investigation had been thoroughly re-examined. The available evidence had been evaluated using investigative and forensic methods unavailable to the original detectives. These developments did not alter the events of 1985. They clarified them. The investigation demonstrated how advances in forensic science can complement, not replace, traditional detective work. The original crime scene documentation remained essential. Witness interviews continued providing important context. Evidence preservation made modern analysis possible. Each stage of the investigation depended upon the work completed by those who came before. Rather than representing separate investigations, they formed a continuous effort extending across nearly 4 decades. By this point, investigators had assembled a body of evidence far more comprehensive than had been possible during the original inquiry. The remaining task was to determine whether that evidence, considered as a whole, met the legal standard required to move the case forward. The answer would determine whether one of South Carolina's longest-running homicide investigations could finally advance from an unsolved case to a criminal prosecution grounded in the verified public record. Nearly 4 decades after Pamela McCall was killed, investigators reached a point that every cold case unit hopes to achieve but few ever experience. The accumulated evidence had to be evaluated not as isolated pieces collected over many years, but as a single investigative record. That distinction was critical. A homicide investigation is rarely solved by one fact alone. Rather, investigators assess whether the totality of the evidence supports a reliable conclusion. Physical evidence, forensic analysis, historical records, investigative documentation, and witness information are considered together. By this stage, the investigation had been reviewed repeatedly by detectives, forensic specialists, and prosecutors. Each review asked essentially the same question: does the available evidence satisfy the legal standard necessary to proceed? Answering that question required more than scientific confidence. It required legal confidence. Prosecutors carefully evaluated whether the evidence could be presented clearly, accurately, and fairly before a jury despite the passage of nearly 40 years. Cold case prosecutions present challenges unlike those found in recent investigations. Time affects every aspect of a case. Witnesses may no longer be available. Documents occasionally require reconstruction from archived records. Investigators themselves may have retired years earlier. Some forensic methods used during the original investigation have since been replaced by newer techniques. Every one of these factors must be considered before charges are filed. For that reason, detectives continued reviewing the historical investigation alongside the modern forensic findings. Nothing was accepted simply because it appeared persuasive. Every conclusion required corroboration. Every scientific result had to fit within the established timeline of the case. Every investigative decision had to remain consistent with the documented record. This methodical approach reflected decades of experience. Investigators understood that a successful prosecution depends not only upon identifying a suspect, but upon demonstrating the reliability of the investigative process itself. The history of the evidence became almost as important as the evidence. Chain of custody documentation established where each item had been stored. Laboratory records documented each examination. Case files recorded investigative decisions made throughout the years. Together, these records demonstrated continuity. The evidence had remained preserved. The investigation had remained active. The commitment to resolving the homicide had never disappeared. This continuity distinguished Pamela McCall's case from many investigations that become permanently unsolved. Although public attention naturally diminished over time, law enforcement continued evaluating new forensic developments as they became available. The case evolved with the science. Rather than beginning again from the beginning, investigators built upon the careful work completed by previous generations of detectives. That continuity illustrates an important principle in modern homicide investigations. Scientific advances are most effective when supported by thorough original police work. Evidence cannot be re-examined decades later if it was never properly collected. DNA cannot be analyzed if biological material was not preserved. Historical timelines cannot be reconstructed without accurate documentation. The original investigation created the foundation upon which later forensic advances could build. As prosecutors completed their review, they considered not only the strength of the scientific evidence, but also its presentation. Jurors would need to understand why the investigation had taken so many years. They would need to understand how forensic science had developed during that period. They would also need to understand why evidence collected in 1985 remained scientifically meaningful decades later. Those explanations form an essential part of many cold case prosecutions. The passage of time may appear unusual to jurors unfamiliar with advances in forensic science. Investigators therefore prepare carefully to explain both the historical investigation and the modern scientific methods that eventually allow the case to move forward. For Pamela McCall's family, these developments represented the possibility that the criminal justice system could finally address questions left unanswered since 1985. Although no investigation can reverse the consequences of homicide, identifying the person responsible can provide factual resolution after years of uncertainty. Many families of homicide victims have described that distinction. Justice cannot restore what was lost. It can establish accountability. The investigation also reflected broader changes in American criminal justice. Over the past several decades, advances in forensic science have significantly expanded the ability of law enforcement agencies to revisit unsolved violent crimes. Cases once considered unlikely to be solved have returned to active investigation because preserved evidence could be examined using methods unavailable at the time of the original offense. Pamela McCall's case became part of that broader history. It demonstrated the value of evidence preservation. It demonstrated the importance of detailed investigative documentation. It demonstrated the continuing role of scientific innovation in criminal investigations. Most importantly, it demonstrated the persistence required to investigate homicide across generations. By the time investigators completed their extensive review, they had assembled an investigative record that reflected nearly 40 years of work. The file documented thousands of investigative hours. It included original reports, supplemental reviews, laboratory analyses, evidence inventories, and prosecutorial evaluations accumulated across multiple decades. Every section of that record represented the efforts of professionals committed to answering the same question. Who was responsible for Pamela McCall's death? As the investigation approached its conclusion, detectives recognized that the case had become something larger than a single homicide investigation. It had become an example of how modern forensic science and traditional investigative methods can complement one another. Neither could have succeeded alone. The original evidence collection made later testing possible. The later testing gave renewed significance to the original investigation. Together, they created an evidentiary record capable of supporting decisions that would have been impossible in 1985. For investigators who had devoted years to reviewing the case, that outcome represented the culmination of sustained, methodical work rather than a sudden breakthrough. Cold cases are rarely solved in a single moment. More often, they are resolved through the gradual accumulation of verified facts until the available evidence forms a clear and legally supportable picture. That process had taken decades. But by this stage, investigators believed they had reached the point where the evidence itself, not speculation, not assumption, but evidence, would determine the next chapter in the case of Pamela McCall. After years of renewed forensic analysis, historical review, and legal evaluation, investigators reached the stage that every cold case investigation ultimately seeks. The evidence had to answer one final question. Was it sufficient to support criminal charges? In homicide investigations, that decision is never based on a single factor. Prosecutors evaluate the totality of the evidence, considering forensic findings alongside investigative records, witness information, documented timelines, and all other admissible facts. The objective is not simply to identify a suspect, but to determine whether the available evidence can establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in court. For Pamela McCall's case, that evaluation reflected nearly 4 decades of investigative work. The original detectives had documented the crime scene with care. Evidence technicians had preserved biological material that would later become central to renewed forensic analysis. Successive investigators had maintained the integrity of the case file through years of periodic review. Laboratory scientists had applied increasingly sophisticated methods as technology advanced. Prosecutors had carefully assessed whether the resulting evidence satisfied the legal standards required for prosecution. Each stage depended upon the one before it. No single development solved the case by itself. Rather, the investigation evolved gradually as scientific capabilities improved while the underlying evidence remained preserved. This progression illustrates one of the defining characteristics of modern cold case investigations. Scientific advances rarely replace traditional detective work. They strengthen it. The careful collection of evidence in 1985 made later laboratory testing possible. The detailed investigative records provided context for interpreting scientific findings. The combination of forensic science and conventional investigation allowed detectives to re-evaluate historical evidence with greater confidence than had previously been possible. As the investigation moved toward prosecution, law enforcement agencies continued emphasizing accuracy over speed. Cold case investigations often involve events that occurred decades earlier. Accordingly, every investigative step must be supported by reliable documentation. Every forensic conclusion must be reproducible. Every item of evidence must be accounted for through an unbroken chain of custody. These safeguards exist not only to protect the integrity of the prosecution, but also to ensure fairness within the criminal justice system. The public often imagines cold case breakthroughs as dramatic moments. In reality, they are usually administrative as much as investigative. Reports are reviewed. Laboratory findings are verified. Prosecutors examine applicable statutes. Investigators prepare detailed summaries of the evidence. Only after these steps are completed does the case proceed toward formal legal action. That process reflects the seriousness of bringing homicide charges after many years. Accuracy remains the overriding priority. By this point, Pamela McCall's investigation had become a demonstration of how long-term evidence preservation can influence criminal justice. The biological evidence collected in 1985 remained scientifically valuable because it had been preserved according to accepted investigative procedures. Without that preservation, later advances in forensic analysis could not have been applied. The case therefore underscored an important lesson for homicide investigators nationwide. Evidence should be preserved whenever possible. Scientific capabilities continue evolving. Methods unavailable today may become routine tomorrow. This principle has shaped investigative practices across many jurisdictions. Cold case units routinely re-evaluate unsolved homicides when significant advances in forensic science occur. Some reviews confirm earlier conclusions without identifying a suspect. Others eliminate previously considered possibilities. Occasionally, they generate sufficient evidence to support renewed investigative action. Pamela McCall's case belonged to that final category. The investigation also highlighted the collaborative nature of modern homicide investigations. Detectives alone do not solve cold cases. Forensic scientists, evidence technicians, prosecutors, and support personnel each contribute essential expertise. The successful resolution of long unsolved investigations depends upon sustained cooperation among these disciplines. Every laboratory report informs investigative decisions. Every investigative finding assists legal review. Every documented fact contributes to the overall evidentiary record. For Pamela's family, the movement of the case toward formal legal proceedings represented the culmination of years of patience. The criminal justice system cannot erase the consequences of homicide, nor can it restore the opportunities taken from the victim. Its role is more limited but equally important: to determine responsibility based upon evidence presented through lawful procedures. Families often describe that process as providing answers rather than closure. The distinction matters. Loss does not disappear. Grief does not expire. What changes is uncertainty. An unanswered question may finally receive an evidence-based response. Throughout the investigation, officials remained careful in their public statements. Law enforcement agencies generally avoid discussing investigative details beyond what is necessary, particularly before court proceedings begin. This approach protects the integrity of the judicial process and helps ensure that legal proceedings are based upon admissible evidence rather than public speculation. The restraint shown throughout Pamela McCall's investigation reflected those long-standing principles. As prosecutors finalized their review, investigators recognized that the case had become part of a broader history of cold case investigations resolved through advances in forensic science. Across the United States, similar investigations have demonstrated that properly preserved evidence can retain investigative value for decades. Each successful prosecution reinforces the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining accurate records, and periodically reevaluating unsolved cases as scientific methods improve. Pamela McCall's case stands among those investigations that illustrate the enduring relationship between science and justice. The homicide remained unsolved for many years, not because investigators abandoned it, but because the available technology had not yet reached the point where the preserved evidence could fully reveal its significance. When science advanced, investigators returned to the evidence. When the evidence produced new information, detectives verified it. When detectives completed their work, prosecutors evaluated it under the standards required by law. That sequence reflects the normal progression of a successful cold case investigation. By the time the case approached its final legal stage, the investigation represented nearly 40 years of professional commitment. Generations of investigators had contributed. Multiple forensic examinations had been completed. The evidentiary record had been strengthened through repeated review. Every stage built upon the work performed by those who came before. The result was not a sudden solution, but the gradual emergence of an investigative record capable of supporting the next step in the criminal justice process. For nearly 4 decades, Pamela McCall's name remained associated with an unsolved homicide. Now, After years of careful forensic review and sustained investigative effort, the case had reached the threshold where the evidence would no longer remain solely within police files. It would enter the courtroom, where the facts gathered across generations would be examined under the rule of law. The story of Pamela McCall's murder is not simply the story of a homicide. It is the story of time. Time that separated investigators from the technology they needed. Time that tested the patience of a family. Time that challenged the determination of every detective who inherited the case. And ultimately, time that demonstrated a remarkable truth. Justice may be delayed. It does not necessarily disappear. When the investigation finally reached the courtroom, the proceedings represented far more than the conclusion of a single criminal case. They reflected decades of careful evidence preservation, repeated forensic review, and the continued commitment of investigators who refused to allow an unsolved homicide to remain permanently unanswered. Like every criminal prosecution in the United States, the case proceeded through the judicial process, where the prosecution bore the burden of proving its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. The filing of charges marked an important investigative milestone, but it was the court's responsibility, not law enforcement's, to determine criminal liability based on the admissible evidence presented at trial. That distinction is fundamental. Police investigate. Prosecutors present evidence. Courts determine guilt. Each institution performs a separate role within the criminal justice system. For Pamela McCall's family, however, the legal process represented something deeply personal. For decades, they had lived with uncertainty. The investigation had remained open. Detectives had continued working. Scientific advances had gradually transformed preserved evidence into meaningful forensic information. Now, after nearly 4 decades, the criminal justice system was able to examine that evidence in a public legal forum. No verdict could restore the years Pamela never had. No courtroom could return birthdays missed, family celebrations left incomplete, or the future that ended in 1985. The purpose of the proceedings was different: to determine responsibility according to law. That objective has guided homicide investigations for generations. The McCall investigation also became part of a broader transformation in forensic science. During the 1980s, many homicide investigations depended heavily upon eyewitness testimony, traditional detective work, and physical evidence that could not always be fully analyzed with the technology then available. Today, the investigative landscape is markedly different. Modern DNA analysis has expanded the ability of forensic laboratories to recover information from biological evidence that once yielded few answers. At the same time, investigators have become increasingly aware of the importance of preserving evidence for future examination. Pamela McCall's case demonstrates why those practices matter. The biological evidence collected in 1985 remained available for later scientific review because it had been preserved according to accepted investigative procedures. Without that preservation, subsequent forensic advances could not have contributed to the investigation. The case therefore illustrates one of the most significant lessons learned by modern homicide investigators. Evidence may become more valuable over time. Not because it changes, because science changes. The investigation likewise illustrates the importance of continuity within law enforcement. Over nearly 40 years, detectives retired. New investigators assumed responsibility. Laboratory methods evolved. Technology advanced. Yet the commitment to investigating Pamela McCall's death remained consistent. Cold case investigations rarely belong to one detective. They belong to institutions. Each generation builds upon the work of those who came before. Original crime scene investigators preserve evidence. Evidence technicians maintain its integrity. Forensic scientists apply new analytical methods. Cold case detectives reevaluate historical findings. Prosecutors determine whether the available evidence satisfies legal standards. The successful resolution of long unsolved homicides depends upon that collective effort. No single individual solves a case spanning decades. The McCall investigation also serves as an important reminder about the relationship between science and justice. Scientific evidence is extraordinarily powerful, yet it does not replace careful investigation. DNA analysis can identify biological material. Investigators must determine its relevance. Forensic findings require context, historical documentation, corroborating evidence, legal evaluation. Each component contributes to the overall reliability of the investigation. This collaborative approach has become the standard for modern cold case investigations throughout the United States. Across the country, numerous families continue waiting for answers in unsolved homicide cases. Some investigations may ultimately remain unresolved because evidence has been lost, degraded, or was never collected. Others continue because preserved evidence still exists, waiting for scientific advances capable of revealing information previously beyond reach. Pamela McCall's case belongs to the latter category. It demonstrates that preserving evidence and maintaining investigative records can create opportunities many years after a crime occurred. Although every case differs, the underlying principle remains consistent. Thorough investigations today create possibilities for tomorrow. As forensic science continues advancing, law enforcement agencies routinely review older homicide investigations to determine whether newly available methods may assist ongoing inquiries. This practice has become an important component of modern criminal investigations. Each scientific improvement offers investigators another opportunity to examine historical evidence with greater precision than before. The story of Pamela McCall therefore extends beyond one investigation. It reflects broader developments in forensic science, evidence preservation, and criminal justice over the past 4 decades. It illustrates how careful investigative work performed in one era can support scientific discoveries made in another. It also reminds us that progress within forensic science benefits not only current investigations but also victims whose cases have remained unresolved for many years. Looking back, the chronology of the investigation is striking. A young nurse lost her life in 1985. Investigators documented the crime scene and preserved critical evidence. For decades, detectives continued reviewing the case as forensic technology advanced. Laboratories applied increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. The evidence was repeatedly evaluated. Eventually, investigators concluded that the available evidence justified moving the case into the judicial system, where the facts could be examined through the legal process. That sequence did not erase the passage of time. It demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily prevent accountability. For investigators, Pamela McCall's case stands as a reminder that careful evidence preservation remains one of the most important responsibilities at any crime scene. For forensic scientists, it illustrates how technological innovation can expand the ability to answer questions once considered impossible. For prosecutors, it highlights the importance of presenting complex, scientific evidence within established legal standards. For the public, it offers a clearer understanding of how modern cold case investigations differ from those conducted decades ago. And for the family of Pamela McCall, it represents the determination of generations of investigators to continue seeking factual answers despite the extraordinary passage of time. The investigation did not rely on a dramatic confession. It did not depend upon chance alone. It evolved through decades of documented police work, preserved evidence, advancing forensic science, and the careful application of legal process. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the case. Cold cases are not frozen in time. They continue to evolve whenever knowledge evolves. Every improvement in forensic science offers another opportunity to examine old evidence with new understanding. Every preserved case file represents the possibility that tomorrow's technology may answer yesterday's questions. Pamela McCall's name remains part of that history, not only because of the crime that ended her life, but because her case demonstrates how perseverance, scientific progress, and the rule of law can intersect across generations in the continuing pursuit of justice.